Hey, everybody, welcome back. We're here with episode 3 of the Blizzard Sports Podcast. Today, I'm happy to say that we have Ben Beecken from the Locked On Wolves podcast. How you doing, Ben?
Doing great. How are you doing?
I'm not doing too bad. Thanks for asking. So today, I just thought that we could kind of introduce you, get to know you a little bit, and then talk about the state of the Wolves as a whole. What do you think about that?
Sounds good to me. Let's do it.
Perfect. So we're coming back. We're talking about Wolves this time instead of Wild or NDSU football. So what's your general feeling on the Wolves right now? I know we've had some trades that we've seen from new GM Tim Conley. We've seen some new signings in the offseason. How do you feel about the team right now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously last season was in general a little bit disappointing. A little bit's maybe an understatement. Coming off 47 wins and pushing Memphis to 6 games in the playoffs in 2022 in the first round, and then making the big Rudy Gobert trade almost exactly a year ago as we're recording this, and then they regress by 5 games. They win only 42 games in the regular season. Obviously, Karl Anthony Towns missed 53 games. That's a huge reason why. But I think if you're looking in that context, it's disappointing. If you're looking in the context of just the last couple of weeks, and we'll get into some of the moves that Tim Connolly's made kind of around the edges, and also the fact that Anthony Edwards is Anthony Edwards, and he also just signed a max contract extension, and he's with the team for the next minimum 5 or 6 years. So, I think overall it's positive right now. I think that the roster is better now than it was a few weeks ago. I truly believe that. And I do think this team will be better next year with a full, roughly a year-ish worth of practices with Gobert and Cat, or at least the ability to be healthy, hopefully going into training camp, knock on wood. And hopefully a full season of actually playing together next year, I think will go a long way. So I think in general, pretty good, even if this season itself was fairly disappointing.
Yeah, I really do believe that this is one of the most talented teams in the league, just on paper. If they can stay healthy and they can play together and they keep practicing and building these minutes together, I really think we're in for something special here in Minnesota. So with the recent moves that I was talking about, you heard about Naz Reid just signing that huge contract. What's your general feeling on that?
Yeah, I think the Naz Reid signing ended up, I think it's definitely a good thing. It's good value. I was a little bit hesitant, and I talked about this quite a bit on Locked On Wolves since the end of the regular season. I was hesitant to give Naz Reid that amount of money, or I would have been if I were the Wolves, simply because obviously your 2 best players, 2 of your 3 best players are Cat and Rudy. Your 2 max players are Cat and Rudy until the Ant extension kicks in. And so why would you pay another center as like your next? Why would you type over $100 million a year in centers essentially? But at the same time, Naz Reid would have gotten more than an average annual value of $14 million on the open market. So in terms of the contract value, it's a smart signing. And of course, you need a third big. We saw that last year when Cat missed 53 games and Rudy was, dinged up and missed a handful of games. I mean, that's going to happen in any season. So it's good value, and everybody in Minnesota loves Naz Reid. He's obviously a fan favorite. He was truly, there aren't very many like homegrown stories, if you will, in the NBA. And Naz Reid is that. He was an undrafted free agent. He got himself into shape, overcame some injuries, did all those things over the course of his first 4 years in Minnesota. And now he gets rewarded with a nice contract. So you feel good for the player, for the person, for Naz. By all accounts, he's a great guy. And he's a good player. Like, there were teams that were surely going to give him more than $14 million a year, and he would have probably had a chance to start somewhere else or play even heavier minutes. Now the question is, how does Chris Finch carve out a real role for Naz Reid within the rotation when there's a fully healthy team? When Rudy and Cat are hopefully entirely healthy and Naz is healthy, what does that look like? That's the next question. But in general, it's a smart signing. Most people in the basketball world, it seems like, felt the same way, just again in terms of sheer value. So overall, I feel really good about the Naz signing as well.
Do you think that the signing of Naz Reid, an offensive big that can contribute to the flow of the whole team, do you think that sets up a Karl Anthony Towns move of any sort?
I wouldn't, no, not necessarily. I don't think it sets it up. It certainly is an insurance policy. If, say, somebody, I had Howard back on Locked On Wolves a couple of weeks ago, and he seemed to pretty strongly believe. In fact, the words he used were, I think he said he would be shocked if Karl Anthony Towns was still on the Wolves past the trade deadline next year. So I think that makes a trade like that, it might grease the wheels a little bit in the sense that, like, you've got a fallback plan. But obviously, if you're trading Cat, you're getting, yes, you'd get picks, but you're getting some sort of front court help back anyway in a trade. So I don't know that it necessarily makes it more likely. But it's again more insurance, more of a fallback. If you do trade Cat, at least you know you have Nas. But again, it's only 2 years guaranteed with the option on the third year, so it's not like it's a super long term solution. I don't know that they're necessarily linked, but it doesn't make it more difficult to trade Cat if they decide that they want to do that.
Right. And then the signing of Anthony Edwards. I think every Timberwolves fan is just absolutely ecstatic about this, but it does kind of put us in a weird situation with those three centers.
Mhm.
Do you think this is all the way just a good plan for the Wolves, or do you think this could set up some problems in the future?
The three center thing.
The Anthony Edwards signing,
Oh,
just
gotcha.
with so much money on the table.
I see. Yeah. I mean, I think that they had to do it, and I think that he's worth it. Is his production right now all NBA level? Worth exactly what he's going to get on the max deal? Not yet, but first of all, that it doesn't kick in until the following year anyway, until fall of 24. And I mean, he could very easily, like, he made the jump to all-star this year. The next thing is all NBA, right? And that's kind of when unofficially, that's when you go from star to superstar, is when, like, hey, you're legitimately in the all NBA conversation. And there's very few of those guys that can make that full leap. He's not far off, and obviously the ceiling is astronomical for Anthony Edwards. So I don't think there was ever any question at all the Wolves were going to give him the max. Yeah, it could put you in a tough spot depending on what Jade McDaniels extension looks like, and that could come through at any time now as well. Uh, but the cap's also going to grow a little bit. We don't know exactly by how much, but it sounds like the estimates now are that it'll grow more than what everybody thought it would in the first place, which gives the Wolves just a little bit more breathing room. So I think, yeah, there's going to be some tweaking to be done by Tim Connolly and the Timberwolves front office, but the Anthony Edwards extension was a no brainer. I think trading Rudy, trading Cat, some of these other moves, obviously Mike Conley's contract's up after this year. There's a lot of things that could happen down the road, but Tim Connolly said right after the season, hey, we're building around Anthony Edwards, and that's not a secret at this point. So, yeah, I think they had to do it. I think it was smart to do it, no question, and they'll figure the rest of it out later.
Absolutely. And we know with a new GM like Tim Conley, a guy who's competent, I really do believe that it'll all work out in the end. And then another signing that we just had in the offseason here was Shake Milton. I know he's a nice combo guard that can do a lot of things. I was pretty excited about this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Shake Milton fits what the Timberwolves were trying to do really well. He basically fills that Jalen Noel-ish role. He's a little bit less of a, like, he's not an ISO scorer in the same way that Jalen Noel was. He's not a like going to score from the mid range like Jalen Noel tried to do, but he'll fill the role of backup combo guard and spot up shooter. And he's not a very good defender, similar to Jalen Noel, but he's better than Noel. Not that that's a high bar to clear, but he's a really good catch and shoot player. Like, certainly better than Jalen Noel, certainly better than Nikhil Alexander-Walker, who, of course, the Timberwolves re-signed as well. But he can run some offense. He can play some point if he needs to. He can play the backup too, and he's just a nice rotational piece. I think in general, the minutes distribution, this will fluctuate based on matchups, but I think Alexander-Walker will see more run in general than Shake Milton, and I think Troy Brown Jr. likely will as well, the other signing, because I think defensively he's certainly better than Shake Milton. But again, depending on matchups, like if you're trailing late in the game and you need some offense, Shake Milton's the guy that's going to come in and knock down threes. When he had a starting role in Philadelphia, in fact, against the Wolves, I think when the Sixers were all banged up, he scored 20 plus against the Wolves in a spot start. So he's got the ability to kind of go off, but he is more of a shooter than he is a true like isolation offensive player. But he's a nice fit because he can do a lot of different things, both on and off the ball. And I think even if he's not a good defender, he's better than Jalen Noel in that regard, and that's going to help shore up that second unit. Just in general, I think the bar of the Timberwolves' depth was raised.
Yeah, I myself was very just enthusiastic about this move. He was one of those guys that we saw the development of in Philadelphia, and he just kept getting better and better. And I think he's found a nice place in the league. We know what he is now. I think he's just going to be a very nice piece with the Timberwolves offensively.
Yeah.
Um, and then what are we going to see in summer league from two guys in particular, Josh Minot and Leonard Miller?
Yeah, I'm excited to see Minot. I'm excited to see Wendell Moore Jr. too. Of course, Minot and Moore both draft picks from last year. Minot the second rounder, Moore the first rounder, and then this year's the first of two second round picks, Leonard Miller. Um, I'm actually that's going to be Friday's show on Locked On Wolves. I'll dive a little bit deeper into each of those guys and specifically what I'm looking to see. But I guess the high level is we want to see, can Josh Minot, we know he's a good defender. We know he can get block shots. We know he's athletic. He can run in the open floor. He's a pretty good cutter. What does the jumper look like? Have the mechanics changed at all? Can he knock down an open shot? And then also, what does he look like if he's guarding the point of attack? We saw it a little bit at the NBA level last year, but in my mind, he's essentially the Jaden McDaniels backup this year, or I think he could be. I'm not sure that he's in the top 10 right now. Like if Chris Finch were to say, if you said, hey, Coach Finch, tell us who your top 10 guys are in the rotation. Mine, it's probably 11. But he could crack that rotation relatively quickly because he is kind of that do stuff guy, right? He does a little bit of everything. He can rebound, he can defend, he can get steals. And so we want to see, can he do some of the other stuff? And then from Leonard Miller, what like if you go back and watch him in the G League last year towards the end of the season, he was really, really, really good. Like he was almost averaging a double-double. He had a 20 rebound game in there. What does the offensive game look like? What does he look like with the ball in his hands? The shot isn't great. That's really the biggest issue with his game is the jumper isn't all that smooth. He doesn't look comfortable shooting jumpers. And he just simply was more polished and in a lot of other areas and physically dominant in the G League. What does he look like with the ball in his hands? I think the Wolves are going to try and allow him some space to operate in summer league and just see, can you run a point? He's basically a power forward, but can you be a point forward? Can you create for others? Can you create for yourself? Or are you just going to try and be more athletic than everybody and rebound the ball, which are all very important things? But what else can you do with the ball in your hands? I think that's going to be a lot of fun to see. And then also Wendell Moore Jr., um, he's supposed to be kind of your prototypical role player at the NBA level. And so the Timberwolves need to see him do those things on a smaller stage. He struggled when given the opportunity, limited opportunities, but as a rookie. And what does he look like defending the point of attack? That to me, he's got to be a better point of attack defender if he's going to crack the rotation this year. And he's got to knock down open shots too. He kind of, his path to a role is basically a 3-and-D type player. And he wasn't consistent enough in his limited opportunities last year.
Yeah, and then we already kind of covered the fit with the three centers, how that might be a little awkward. Then the next thing that I was kind of wondering about was, is Chris Finch the guy? I know we've seen like up games from him, we've seen down games. Um, there's no questioning that he's a great offensive coach, but is he the personality to kind of step in and lead a team to a Larry O'Brien trophy?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing with NBA coaching is it's really hard to quantify in a lot of ways. Like obviously there's guys who X's and O's are just, in-game adjustments are just unbelievable. Whether that, Rick Carlisle comes to mind with in-game adjustments and Eric Spoelstra game-to-game adjustments in the playoffs. Like that's where a lot of that stuff really comes in. I think some of the issues we've seen with Chris Finch last year were a little bit related to rotations. I think timeout management was kind of an issue, both late in games, just like either not using them when you have them or running out of them too soon were kind of the biggest things. And then also the offense being as bad as it was. I mean, he's got this reputation as being a great offensive mind, and the offense last year is bottom 10 basically all season long. Now, they didn't have the team they thought they were going to have, and obviously we've given something of a pass in that regard. But I mean, this is kind of the year, right? Like if this team has effectively the same core as last year's team, right? Like the top, I don't know, 6-7 guys in the rotation are going to be the same players, at least that finished the season. Of course, counting Mike Conley in that group. This team's got to be a, top 12 offense or something. I'm just throwing that out there. They've got to win 46, 47, 48 plus games, or maybe he's not the guy, right? Like I think that's kind of silly in a lot of ways to say like, oh, this is the year he's either the guy or he gets fired, because one of the major problems in not just the NBA, but in pro sports is like, you got to give the guy a little bit of time. But I think if there's 2 years and you don't see progress with all that ownership and Tim Connolly invested in getting Rudy Gobert and now these max contracts for Towns and for Ant and whatever they're going to pay McDaniels, you have to see some fruits for your labor, right? And so there has to be some progress this year. I think Chris Finch is a good coach. The players seem to really like him. I mean, all the public comments are positive, and there's teams, guys don't have to go out of their way to, even if asked, they don't have to go out of their way to be as supportive as like Ant seems to really enjoy playing for Chris Finch. It's clear there were some other guys that didn't get along as well, like D'Angelo Russell, like just nothing like real definitive, but pretty clear that they weren't always on the same page. Right. And I don't know that that's the case now. It seems like the personality fits really well. The question is, does he have, he was a lead assistant for a couple of different teams for several years, and he coached under really good coaches. like Mike Malone and like Nick Nurse, and I guess it was Elvin Gentry when he was in New Orleans. But can he get better with those in-game adjustments? And I thought we'd seen some progress last year, and then at the end of the season, I felt like maybe not as much. So I don't know. I mean, like I know that's not a direct answer to your question. I think we need another year of data, another year of him having this personnel, these three centers, this big roster to try and mold before we really know for sure. But I also I think it's too early to say he is or isn't the guy. I think we need another year.
And shifting to a guy who's kind of shown his support for Chris Finch, Karl Anthony Towns, we've heard some crazy comments from him pretty recently, some trade rumors. What are we going to see from Ket? Because he's kind of, I don't want to say a loose cannon, but he's a little bit unpredictable and emotional at times. Is he going to come out and just play with his hair on fire, like I'll show you mentality, or is he going to kind of shrivel up? Do you think?
Yeah, I think we're going to see more of the same from Cat in that. I mean, hopefully better than last year. Hopefully he's not injured, right? But I think the comments are just kind of come with the territory. It's Cat being Cat. He when he came to the league was a little bit too idealistic sometimes when he talked to the media, and it was like the media's dream because he gave these great sound bites, and like he was willing to talk and very like he gave good sound bites, right? And he was kind of a media darling at Kentucky when he was drafted in Minnesota, and then it got it got to be a little bit like as the years have gone on, it's changed a little as Cat's changed and the perception of Cat has changed. And Cat's Timberwolves have never gotten out of the first round. They've been to the playoffs 3 times, but he's always been with another star. And like we all know, the national media coverage of Cat is not entirely. I don't like saying this generally, but I think it's true. I don't think it's generally fair the way that the media covers Karl Anthony Towns. But at the same time, when Cat does things like make some of the comments you alluded to, changing the game, etc., even if on some level it is true, those are the type of cringy comments that kind of feed into that national narrative that has everybody laughing at Cat. And it's like, even if he's not wrong, a good chunk of the time when he talks, it's sometimes he just needs to, if he wants to see this coverage die down, then say less. But he can obviously do what he wants. He can say what he wants, and I don't know that it's going to have any impact on what he does on the court this year because Cat, we know who he is. And last season, in my mind, is an outlier because of the injury, and he struggled a little when he came back shooting the ball. I think we're going to hear more questions when it gets to be playoff time again because he obviously had a great first half in the play-in loss to the Lakers, but he wasn't great in the Thunder game. He wasn't great for much of the first round series, the loss to the Nuggets. He only had I think one really good game in there in those 5 games. So that's when we'll hear some more questions, but the Wolves got to get there first. So as long as he and Rudy can figure things out on some level, I think we'll forget about the offseason comments here pretty quickly.
For sure. And then coming off of this being Cat's team, I think we've all embraced it being Anthony Edwards, and he's going to be the guy and the leader. Um, it kind of seems like him and Jaden McDaniels are forming like this dynamic duo. And when you take both peaks, both absolute ceilings, do you think that that pair and Chris Finch is title worthy?
I mean, that's the hope, right? Like it's Jaden McDaniels and Anthony Edwards are still only entering year 4. So it's really early. Like we could go through and look at some of these other stars and how long it takes them to kind of reach that level. I mean, there's very few exceptions of guys who even now are Hall of Famers or will be Hall of Famers. Look at this is a very different situation, but Nikola Jokic is a good example of somebody who he literally won the MVP each of the last 2 years, but his teams couldn't get past the second round. And so people were just assuming they weren't going to win the championship this year. And it can just happen like that. I mean, so many things have to go right, obviously, for that to happen. But we're very likely a couple years out from the Timberwolves being considered serious championship contenders. But guess what? I mean, you get out of the first round once, and then you look up and Ant is 24, and you just got to the second round. That's when the media and the people that predict these sorts of things start to take you more seriously, and it becomes more of a realistic possibility. So, yeah, I mean, I think they're young enough and have enough talent for that to be a real thing. Is it when Cat is still in Minnesota? Is it when Rudy Gobert is still in Minnesota? I don't know. It's very likely that both Ant and Jaden McDaniels outlast both Cat and Rudy. Rudy only has this year plus one more and then a player option, which he'll likely opt into. And then Cat, of course, just signed the extension, but there's all these trade rumors, or I should say rumors that potentially he's traded in the next year. So, yeah, I mean, it's certainly certainly possible, and that's the hope. I think the first order of business is getting out of the second round for just the second time in franchise history, and hopefully, I mean, that feels like a realistic goal for this season. And then from there, I think we can have a better shot at projecting out what happens next.
And then with that goal, you get the first round, second round, third round, and eventually championship progression that we all want to see. If we don't hit that and we don't even make the playoffs and we're just kind of sputtering toward the trade deadline, who's out? Like, what moves are going to be made to either sell off our players to other contending teams? Who do you think could be moved at the trade deadline?
Yeah, I mean, I think if this team's struggling, 500 or worse, I I would even venture to say it's likely that Towns is traded at the deadline if the team is really struggling, because it'd be easy. Well, it for sure would be easier to move him then because the salary is so much lower. It jumps next summer, so he becomes tougher for salary matching next summer. Also, if there's a team looking to get that bump at the end of this season, there's that value. So I think if the Wolves are struggling, that's the immediate pivot. Like, they're not going to trade McDaniels, they're not going to trade Ant. You could trade Rudy, but you're going to get a lot less back for him. So I think the Wolves would kind of, I'm sure that they've weighed the whole thing. Like, what could we get for Rudy? What could we get for Cat? Um, and depending on how the season plays out, I think that's the first move. I don't, unless the Wolves are like, I don't know, some terrible record like 10-20 or something in December, January. They're not going to fire Chris Finch in season. I just don't think that's something Tim Connolly would do. Um, so I think that, like, yeah, the trade deadline move would probably be Cat or Rudy, but more likely Cat. End of the season, if this team misses the playoffs somehow or loses in the play-in or gets swept in the first round or one of those disastrous finishes, then yeah, I think it's Chris Finch that would be let go. Remember, he wasn't hired by Tim Connolly, and while they have a history together, and obviously Connolly's said very great things about Chris Finch, it's entirely possible that that if this team just doesn't finish the way that we already talked about Finch's performance this year, if this team doesn't finish in a really positive way this year, that it's very possible that Finch is let go at the end of the season. I'd be really surprised if it happened in season, though.
For sure. And you put the ball in the tee there for me for this Tim Connolly transition. I just want to know your general feeling on the guy because there's been the low that was the Rudy Gobert trade, but then he made all these little tweaky moves and he really helped out the roster. I really feel like that gave Ant a Mike Conley to kind of play off of and work with. And I really do like the draft that he had. So, what's your general feeling on the guy?
Yeah, I mean, I still think he, like, because of the track record, because of the fact he basically built the Nuggets, and obviously we have to give credit to his to his successor in Calvin Booth, who of course played and coached and was in the front office for the Wolves as well. Calvin Booth was, um, because Calvin Booth put the finishing touches on this last year's championship roster. The Jeff Greens and the guys like that, but in general, Tim Connolly's got a great track record of building the majority of that Nuggets team, of the second round picks, of course, of Jokic and Monty Morris, who was a big piece of their, when they were the best team in the Western Conference for a couple of years, um, making some of their other selections. And then now in Minnesota, you're right. I mean, other than the Rudy trade, which no matter, unless the Wolves win the title this year, it's not going to be seen as a good trade regardless, but there's still time to salvage it in a sense, right? We don't know exactly where that's going to finish. We can't put a bow on it yet. It's been barely a calendar year. But I think, to your point, all the other, the Kyle Anderson signing last summer, the re-signing of Torian Prince, the trade deadline acquisition of Mike Conley, and now it seems like the extension for Naz Reid was a good move. All these things that he's done seem to have been really savvy, and he's been willing to make some of those moves around the edges that I think some of his predecessors had not been. And the jury's obviously still out on both of his drafts, but like, there's nothing to suggest that Josh Minott, Wendell Moore can't become rotational pros. And it really seems like most people think he did a really good job this year trading, acquiring that second round pick to get Leonard Miller. A couple of people out there, Sam Vecini at The Athletic had a number 13 overall, like a lottery grade on Miller. They're like, by all accounts, all of the other moves have been positive. And it's so hard to like give a definitive, hey, he's great or he's terrible at this moment, because we need to see how the Gobert thing plays out, because no matter what else he does, that is the move. And if the Wolves trade Towns, that's the next big move, right? So like the Wolves have only had one season. He's barely been on the job. He's been on the job for less than 14 months. I think depending on how this year turns out, we can have a much better sense. If the Wolves win 52 games and go to the conference finals or something like that, then I think the view of Tim Connolly is very positive. Could they have done the same thing had they never made the Gobert trade? Maybe. But these are the players the Wolves have in this moment in time, and it matters what happens to them moving forward. So I have a lot of confidence in Tim Connolly. I think they took a swing last year, and it's hard to fault them for taking a swing. And we'll see how this year plays out. If it's another disappointing season, I'll probably feel differently in 12 months. But sitting here right now, I still have confidence in Tim Connolly. I think he's a really good executive.
Yeah, I really do like him a lot. Do you think that the Rudy Gobert trade, we kind of sold the farm for the superstar and it didn't exactly pan out the way we wanted? Do you think that could have been just a little bit of new owner syndrome of like, hey, Tim, can you make this move for us? Like, we want to make a splash coming in here.
Yeah, I do. I do. And there's been a lot of reporting about, Mark Laurie and Alex Rodriguez both being into advanced stats and analytics. And, anybody can go to Basketball Reference and sort guys by win shares. And I'm not saying that's exactly what happened because, Tim Connolly should have had the final say in something like this, like, hey, we should or we shouldn't do this. And it sounds like Chris Finch got on board too. I'll always be curious about how much convincing it took in which direction this went. Like if my hunch, and I don't know this, but my hunch is that Connolly had like all these options and was like, hey, here's our best chance at getting a star. I think we can do this. Ownership was like, oh yeah, let's make the splash. And then it probably took a second to convince Chris Finch to get on board. But also like Chris Finch is, I mean, they could have just fired him if he didn't get on board, right? Because he was hired by the previous president of basketball operations. So I don't know exactly how all that went. But I do think that the owners were involved. It does sound like they were excited. Now, they're not majority owners yet, of course, but we know that Glenn Taylor kind of gave the keys to them and some of this personnel stuff. So I certainly think that played into it. It like Tim Connolly certainly made everybody believe that he thought that this would work. And Chris Finch is like, he's the coach to make it work with his history coaching in Denver and with the two bigs in New Orleans several years ago. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, yes, I'm sure that the new ownership stuff played into it on some level. It's just hard to know exactly how much.
Yeah, and I'm sure there was just some like automatic look to Utah because, I mean, your biggest problem is defensive rebounding and defense under the rim. Who's the guy that's available? It's the dude with the 11-foot wingspan that grabs
Yeah.
every rebound and won 2 defensive player of the years.
Right.
Right. Well, I think we're ready to wrap it up and bring it home. Um, I'll bring up your information here. And yeah, just go for it. You can plug your podcast, plug your Twitter, whatever you would like.
Cool. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah. So Lockdown Wolves, wherever you listen to podcasts, also YouTube. There's a Lockdown Sports Minnesota app. You can watch Lockdown Wild, Lockdown Wolves, Lockdown Vikings, Gophers. Who am I forgetting? Twins. Everybody over there at the Lockdown Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV, and of course you can follow on Twitter. And my Twitter handle is below on the screen. It's at Beecken. So yeah, definitely listen to the show. Subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts.
Hey, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jack.
Talk to you later.